In the early months of 1917, the United States still stood outside the inferno that had consumed Europe for more than 2 years. The World War had torn apart regions from Flanders to the Middle East, and though Americans followed the headlines with fascination and dread, most believed firmly that the conflict was not theirs to fight. Many remembered President Woodrow Wilson's campaign slogan from the previous autumn: "He kept us out of the war." And it was true. Wilson, the scholar-turned-president, had steered the nation through the first phase of the catastrophe with stern neutrality, insisting the United States remain, in his words, neutral in fact as well as in name. American society, however, was anything but unified. The country's newspapers, churches, unions, immigrant groups, and political parties offered a chorus of conflicting sentiments. Some admired Britain and France, others distrusted old European empires in general. Many feared that entering the war would destroy American lives and disrupt an economy that had only recently recovered from recession. But despite this division, a majority still clung to the hope that diplomacy could keep the United States at peace. Across the Atlantic, Germany's leaders watched the situation with growing anxiety. Their armies had survived the enormous bloodletting of Verdun, the Somme, but they could see no clear path to victory. A war of attrition favored the Allies, whose access to global resources surpassed Germany's. Worse still, a harsh winter was tightening its grip on German civilians, bringing shortages of food and fuel. The British blockade, though not airtight, was slowly strangling the Central Powers' ability to sustain the war. By late 1916, a sense of desperation had settled over Berlin. What followed were a series of gambles, bold, reckless, and ultimately catastrophic. But before those decisions were made, American neutrality had already been tested again and again. In 1914, Wilson urged Americans to restrain their passions. He warned that the conflict would try men's souls, and that only strict neutrality, impartial in thought as well as action, could prevent divisions at home from becoming dangerous. Many Americans took these words seriously. Popular culture reflected the mood, with songs like "I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier" becoming unexpected hits. Still, neutrality did not mean unanimity. On the East Coast, cultural and economic ties to Britain and France helped tilt public sentiment toward the Allies. American trade with Europe surged. The sale of arms alone ballooned from just a few $1 million before the war to hundreds of millions by 1917. On the streets of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, newspapers often depicted Germany as militaristic and autocratic. Cartoons and editorials contrasted the democracies of the Entente with the authoritarian governments of Germany and Austria-Hungary. Yet millions of Americans had roots in those very same Central European lands. German Americans, one of the nation's largest ethnic groups, felt both pride and apprehension as the war unfolded. Most wished for peace, but many resented the increasingly anti-German tone of American media. Irish Americans, long distrustful of Britain, tended to sympathize with anyone who challenged the British Empire. Jewish Americans, many of whom had fled oppression in the Russian Empire, hesitated to support a cause that included the Tsar. And socialist labor unions opposed the war on ideological grounds, suspicious of bankers, arms dealers, and political elites. Over time, however, American reporters embedded in Europe helped nudge public opinion toward the Allies. They witnessed devastated towns in Belgium, France, and Serbia. Though they were careful to warn readers about exaggerated atrocity stories, they still reported on real abuses committed by German forces. Their dispatches carried the smell of burning villages, the sight of refugees crowding muddy roads, and the stark truth that in this war, civilians were never far from danger. But even as the American public absorbed these accounts, the decisive blows came at sea. Germany's U-boats prowled the Atlantic, striking at British and French shipping. The goal was simple: choke off Britain's maritime lifelines. But submarines were unpredictable weapons, and their torpedoes too often hit civilian vessels. The 1915 sinking of the Lusitania shocked the United States. More than 1,000 people died, including 128 Americans. Later, the Arabic, the Ancona, and finally, the Sussex met similar fates. Each sinking produced anger, diplomatic protests, and demands for Germany to change its naval tactics. Germany, fearing American entry into the war, eventually agreed to restrict submarine warfare. Berlin promised that passenger ships would no longer be sunk without warning, and that merchant vessels would be searched for weapons before being attacked. But these concessions were made reluctantly. German generals watched American arms shipments to the Allies and complained bitterly that neutrality had become meaningless. If the United States sold weapons to Britain and France, they argued, then Germany had every right to retaliate.
Inside the United States, tensions escalated. Austro-Hungarian agents plotted sabotage missions to disrupt munitions production. German operatives detonated explosives at a massive ammunition depot in New Jersey, the Black Tom disaster, scattering debris across the New York skyline. Another operative attempted to blow up a rail bridge to Canada. These plots did not alter the course of the war, but they hardened American attitudes toward the Central Powers. At home, Congress debated how to strengthen national defenses. The preparedness movement, led by figures like former President Teddy Roosevelt, pushed for a larger army and navy. Roosevelt blasted Wilson as weak and naive, accusing him of endangering the nation with what he called professional pacifism. Wilson, though reluctant, eventually approved a major expansion of American military forces in 1916. By the start of 1917, the United States remained neutral, but the ground beneath that neutrality was shifting. Germany now stood at a crossroads. Its new military leaders, Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, believed the current stalemate was unsustainable. They insisted that only a return to unrestricted submarine warfare could bring victory. They calculated that if German U-boats could sink enough ships, hundreds of thousands of tons of cargo each month, Britain would be starved into surrender within 5 months. If the United States entered the war, it wouldn't matter, they claimed. America was far away, and American armies slow to assemble. German civilian leaders hesitated. Chancellor Beckmann Hollweg warned that provoking the United States would bring ruin. But the generals pushed harder. Morale in Germany was fragile, they argued. Food was scarce. Something drastic had to be done. And so, in late January 1917, the Kaiser approved unrestricted submarine warfare. On February 1st, German subs received orders to attack all vessels, neutral or otherwise, near British waters without warning. 2 days later, the United States broke diplomatic relations with Germany. But Wilson did not declare war. Not yet. The president still hoped for peace and feared that a reckless response might plunge the nation into conflict against the will of its people. He proposed arming American merchant ships, though opponents in Congress delayed the effort. Wilson ultimately moved forward by executive order in March. Then came the shock that transformed public opinion overnight. On March 1st, newspapers revealed the contents of the Zimmermann telegram. In this secret message, Germany proposed that Mexico join the Central Powers if the United States entered the war. In exchange, Germany promised financial aid and encouraged Mexico to reclaim Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, lands lost decades earlier. It was a fantastical proposal, unrealistic under any circumstances, especially since Mexico was consumed by revolution, and Japan, whom Germany also tried to entice, was already fighting alongside the Allies. But when German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann publicly confirmed the telegram's authenticity, Americans reacted with fury. For many, The idea that Germany sought to stir conflict on the American border was intolerable. It violated the long-standing Monroe Doctrine and suggested that Germany was willing to export instability to the Western Hemisphere. Though historians still debate the telegram's exact impact, it undeniably weakened the last pillars of American neutrality. In the same week, revolution erupted in Russia, overthrowing the Tsar and establishing a provisional government. Now, Wilson could argue that the war was a struggle of democracies against autocratic powers. The moral framing was irresistible to him. He believed deeply that the United States had a responsibility to shape a just and lasting peace. Then came the final spark. On March 16th, a German submarine torpedoed the American ship Vigilancia, killing 15 Americans. 2 more American vessels were sunk in the days that followed. Wilson had long said he would not lead the nation into war unless Germany committed what he called an overt act. Now, those acts had come. He faced the choice he had tried to avoid for nearly 3 years. But he also sensed that the country had changed. The outrage over the U-boats and the Zimmerman telegram convinced many Americans that neutrality was no longer safe. And so, on April 2nd, President Wilson addressed Congress. His speech was solemn and decisive. He declared that Germany's actions were nothing less than war against the United States. He insisted America sought no conquest, no dominion, no indemnities, only the defense of human rights and the preservation of peace. He said, "The world must be made safe for democracy." It was a phrase that would echo for generations. 4 days later, Congress voted in overwhelming support. The United States entered the Great War as an associated power, aligning with the Allies but retaining independence from their previous agreements. It would take many months before American soldiers arrived in Europe in large numbers, and even longer before they transformed the battlefield. But the entry of the United States tipped the balance decisively. The war had entered a new phase. Nearly a quarter-century later, the United States would again join a world conflict, this time after the attack on Pearl Harbor. But unlike in 1917, the Allies of the Second World War would eventually cross the German frontier, stand on the banks of the Rhine, and confront the Nazi regime on its own soil. The echo of 1917 lingered, a reminder of the moment the United States first stepped fully into the role of global power.